want to start today by reading the little story that this is all based on. It comes from Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 to 28. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and is suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." But the woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. And he replied, "It's not right to give the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, your faith is great. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. There's a very human characteristic, goes like this. If we don't like the message, just shoot the messenger. Happens a lot in politics. If one side doesn't have a valid argument against the other side's idea, then they turn to assassinating the leader or the person who brought the idea up in the first place. It's actually been taken to quite extreme in the USA, where university professors have found themselves sacked because they have expressed an idea that is contrary to popular opinion. Now, you would think in a university, an educational facility, that you could express any opinion you like and put it up for critical discussion. But instead now what's happening, the students protest and the lecturer gets sacked. It's called cancel culture. Probably won't be long before we see it happening here. But it's not a new human characteristic. So I want to go back to today's reading. But it's good to set today's reading in its context. 2 weeks ago we read the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 plus people on a tiny amount of food. Last week we had the story of Jesus walking on water and stopping a storm. And then when we read on, we see that when Jesus and his disciples finally landed on the other side, there were crowds of people there and they were begging for healing. And they said, "We just want to touch the edge of your robe and we'll be healed." And it says they were. Everyone who touched his clothes was healed. Now that's pretty awesome. Surely we'd be asking ourselves, how on earth can this happen? Then we read at the beginning of chapter 15, the Pharisees came to Jesus with a question. Now, surely they were going to ask him about how all this has been happening. But no. They said, "Why don't your disciples do the ritual hand washing before they eat meals?" It's a little bit like if we saw the SES or CFA or someone doing a daring, very brave rescue of some people from a burning vehicle, and we went up to them afterwards and said, "Why is your truck dirty? Don't you know you should keep your equipment clean?" Jesus called the Pharisees blind guides. They were spiritual leaders, but they were so focused on the rules that they themselves had made up that they couldn't see God at work. Jesus was a massive challenge to them because the people were flocking to Jesus and they could see that they were losing their authority and power. But they were so narrow in their focus that they weren't able to see that God was doing something quite different from what they were used to. So Jesus had a discussion with them about their rules and regulations regarding food and showing them how ridiculous their laws were. And then starts today's story. So he left the area. He went into foreign territory, Phoenicia. Now, last time he tried to be alone with his disciples, he'd just gone across the lake to a quiet spot, but the people had seen him and raced around the lake and were all there when he got there. This time he goes out of the territory into a foreign country. It's an area that had never been conquered by the Israelites, even under King David, who extended the territory the greatest it ever was, but he still hadn't conquered this area of Phoenicia. So Jesus is there in what is enemy territory. He's approached by a woman begging for help for her daughter. He didn't respond immediately, and the disciples said, "God, send her away. She's being a real pest." Well, after all, she was a woman. She was a Gentile, and in Jewish eyes, Gentiles really were no better than dogs. "Send her away. She keeps crying out after us." But that's an indication that she wasn't someone who was going to give up easily. When Jesus did speak, he said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." And she doesn't give up then. In fact, she runs round in front of him, gets down on her hands and knees and begs him, "Help me." Jesus answered, "Well, it isn't really right to take the children's food and give it to the dog." But she replied, "Yes, it is. Even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the master's table." That's where Jesus commended her for her great faith, and her daughter was healed. So what's going on in this story? When the woman approached Jesus, she said this, "Lord, Son of David." Then she called out for mercy, "Have mercy on me." She had a greater understanding of who Jesus was than most Jews did at the time. Not only did she seem to understand who he was, but she understood the nature of God. God is a God who reaches out in mercy. So throwing herself down in front of him, it's a gesture of submission. She knew she had no right to demand anything of God, but she knew that God would have mercy on his people. Now, it says in the reading, Jesus said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." Actually, there's no punctuation in the Greek, and the sentence could be read like this: "Was I sent only to the lost sheep of Israel?" And then perhaps a further questioning myself, well, is it right to give what's meant for the children and give it to the dogs? But it's with the woman's great persistence and insight that she says, yeah, but even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the table. And Jesus sees that her faith is amazing and her request is granted. The woman was a Gentile, seen as unclean by the Jews. Her daughter was troubled by a demon, which would have been seen as some sort of punishment for her wickedness. But this Gentile had more faith and more persistent faith than the Jewish people. She also realised that all she needed was one crumb. She recognised the awesome power of God that was at work in Jesus. The pattern is shown right through the New Testament. Paul would go to places around the Mediterranean to spread the news of Jesus. And when he went to a place, he would first go into the synagogue and talk to the Jewish people. But time and again, they rejected him. And so he would go to the general population, the Gentiles. They'd hear and they would receive the news. People who did not have previously conceived ideas were the ones who were open to the message. This encounter with the Canaanite woman is the first indication that the message of Jesus was for all people. The Jews were the ones through whom Jesus came into the world, but the message would spread from them to the Gentiles. In fact, the Gentile mission was much more successful than mission to the Jewish people. And Paul actually indicates somewhere, and I couldn't find the reading, but I know it's there, where he says he has the hope that when the Jewish people see how the Gentiles are being changed, that they too will come to believe in Jesus. So salvation comes from the Jews in Jesus, and it returns to them through the Gentiles. So God's working through both groups of people. We actually see a move happening today, a movement in Israel called One Israel or One for Israel. It's a movement amongst Jewish people living in Israel who are coming to faith in Jesus. And one of the most powerful things that's happening for them is the realisation that Jesus was a Jew. And also that the New Testament is simply the fulfilment of the Old Testament. It's not a completely separate book. The message of Jesus is for all. We need to make sure that our minds are not so closed by our expectation that we're not open to see what God might be doing when he's doing something different among us.
I want to know